Now, I know that for many of you who saw the advertisements for this program, you might just want to jump straight into the evidence for Christianity. And trust me, I get that completely. Frankly, I kind of want to do that as well. However, before we get into the evidence for Christianity, I think it's best that we discuss the nature of evidence. And the reason for that is because by understanding what evidence is and how we can use evidence to come to conclusions, we can better appreciate the evidence we do have for Christianity. Not only that, it'll allow us to clear up numerous misconceptions that people have regarding Christianity and the evidence for it. But before we discuss the nature of evidence, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about myself, because that might also help you understand why I'm giving these sorts of talks to begin with. I'd first like to state that despite co-hosting these talks on Christian apologetics, I have no intention to become a pastor, a priest, theologian, deacon, what have you. In fact, I'm planning on pursuing a career in biology. So some people might ask, why would I bother hosting a talk on Christian apologetics if I have no intention of going into a religious field? Well, one of the reasons is because I'm normally a pretty skeptical person. If something sounds a little bit too good to be true, or if it's a little bit too outlandish for my tastes, I'm generally quite hesitant to believe it. And so you could probably imagine that given my skepticism, I value good, solid evidence for people's beliefs. At the end of the day, I do believe that our beliefs should be supported by the evidence. And you could probably already see why I'd want to give a talk like this, given that apologetics is all about providing evidence for one's beliefs. However, there is another reason I'm giving these talks, this of course being that I grew up in the mid-2010s with unrestricted internet access. And so that means I grew up in an online environment where it was frankly just common knowledge that there's no evidence for the existence of God. Everyone kind of knew that. I mean, in the 2010s, this was kind of the peak, the prime for many very prominent atheists like Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and the amazing atheists who are all depicted here. So, given that I was on the internet during this time, I was in an online environment where everybody knew there's no evidence for God. Everybody knew that Jesus didn't exist, let alone that he performed miracles. And of course, everyone knew that there isn't any evidence that anything in the Bible actually happened. This is just common knowledge after all. It's common sense. None of this is true. So you'd probably imagine that me, who cares quite deeply about the evidence, would be kind of troubled by this. Is it actually true that there's no evidence for Christianity? Is praying, reading the Bible, and going to church all just a big waste of time? Well, I decided probably close to about a decade ago to investigate this claim, that there isn't any evidence for Christianity. And what I found is that, frankly, that claim that there's no evidence for Christianity is somewhat lacking in evidence. So the reason I kind of wanted to give these talks at the end of the day is because there is very good evidence for Christianity. And in fact, I think the evidence is far stronger than most people, including most Christians, think. And so, I frankly just couldn't help but share this evidence. Now this begs the question though, what is evidence? That may sound like a very silly thing to ask. Everyone knows what evidence is after all. But at least in my experience, no, people don't know what evidence is. In fact, if you ask the average person to define what evidence is, probably the best answer you're going to get is that evidence is evidence. And that's not a functional definition, now is it? So let's first define evidence so that we can understand what counts as evidence. And by knowing that, we can then understand how we can use evidence to come to true conclusions. Now, there's a few different definitions of evidence, but all of them are generally quite similar. The first definition I found by just looking it up on Google is that evidence is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. Now, proposition is basically just like a claim, so we'll go on with that in a little bit. Another very similar definition for evidence that I found is that evidence is any data that raises the probability of a given proposition. A third, extremely similar definition for evidence that I found is that evidence is any fact or piece of information that makes a hypothesis more likely to be true. And for the sake of this presentation, hypothesis, proposition, claim, these are all effectively synonymous. Now, I decided to take all of these three definitions and kind of blend them together into a hybrid definition to kind of simplify things while getting the main points of all three of these definitions. So my definition of evidence is that evidence is information that raises the probability that a given claim is true. I think this is a very good and reasonable way of understanding evidence, but it might still be a bit abstract at the moment. So let's use some examples to basically understand what counts as evidence. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you wanted to know whether or not I own a red Ferrari. So here, the proposition, hypothesis, or claim is that I own such a vehicle. And now, you want to find evidence to see whether or not this proposition is true. So what would count as evidence? Well, let's say you decided to ask me whether or not I own such a vehicle, and I told you I do own a red Ferrari. Would that count as evidence? Well, some of you might be surprised to hear that yes, that actually would count as evidence, because it does very slightly raise the probability that our proposition that I own such a vehicle is true. Now, even if it only raised the probability of that proposition being true by like 0.1%, that still counts as evidence because it is raising that probability. Now, some of you may find that kind of strange, and you probably wouldn't believe me that I actually owned a red Ferrari if I just told you I did. I don't blame you. But this is where we can clear up a very common misconception about evidence. Just because a particular piece of evidence isn't convincing on its own, that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't evidence. It just means that that particular piece of evidence is weak. So you need to find more evidence to verify if this given proposition is true or not. So, because you remain unconvinced that I own a red Ferrari, which I don't know why you wouldn't be convinced of me just telling you, you decide to go ask a few other people who know me, such as family and friends. If you asked 5 of my family members or friends and all 5 of them told you that I did own such a vehicle, that would act as further evidence that I own a red Ferrari. But notice here that the type of evidence that we've used hasn't actually changed. We're still working off of people's claims that I own this vehicle. But the fact that multiple people all independently claim that I own this vehicle acts as much stronger evidence to strengthen the idea that I own a red Ferrari. If, furthermore, you decided to go to my house and you noticed there was a red Ferrari parked outside of it, well, that would act as even more evidence that our hypothesis is true. And I think by this point you probably get the idea. Any information that makes our hypothesis more likely to be true counts as evidence. And what this means is very interesting, because it means that even things like arguments can actually count as evidence in the right context. Let me give another example to kind of better illustrate that. Let's say after I told you that I owned a red Ferrari, you didn't believe me. You think I'm lying about this. So now the new proposition, hypothesis, or claim you want to find evidence for is that I was simply lying when I told you I owned a red Ferrari. So what evidence could we get to figure out whether or not I was lying? Well, let's say you decided to ask a friend of mine whether or not I owned a red Ferrari, and they told you that they didn't know if I owned such a vehicle. Would them not knowing this count as evidence? Not necessarily. The fact that they don't know if I own a vehicle doesn't really make our new hypothesis more likely to be true or less likely to be true. However, you could make a very good argument that if I actually owned a red Ferrari, it would be quite strange that a close friend of mine wouldn't know about it. So you could see here that an argument based on what my friend has told you can still be used as evidence to support your hypothesis. Now, I admit this is what's referred to as an argument from silence, and generally those aren't considered the strongest arguments to support a claim. So you might decide to continue probing my friend to see whether or not you can get more information to see whether or not I'm lying. And if my friend told you that in a previous conversation I mentioned that buying expensive sports cars was just a big waste of money, well, that would act as even more evidence that I was lying when I said I owned a red Ferrari. Why is that? Because you could make a very good argument that I probably wouldn't go out and buy a red Ferrari given I have that kind of attitude towards sports cars. And I think by this point you can kind of see what I'm getting at. Even arguments can act as evidence under the right circumstances. And in fact, in fields like philosophy, arguments might actually be the primary form of evidence for something. So I think by now you probably have a very good idea of what qualifies as evidence. Things like logical arguments, physical evidence, and eyewitness reports can all qualify as evidence because every single one of these things can make a given proposition, hypothesis, or claim more likely to be true. So now we know what evidence is. Great. How can we use evidence to actually demonstrate that something is true? How can you use evidence to prove something? Well, you can't, unless, of course, you're a mathematician. You see, math is one of the only fields I'm aware of in which you can actually definitively prove things. For example, you can prove with 100% certainty that 2 + 2 = 4. However, the second we leave the field of math, you don't generally get the luxury of being able to prove things with certainty anymore. And I think this is very crucial for our discussion on apologetics, because this, I find, is sometimes the very first mistake people make when they try to evaluate the evidence for Christianity. You see, I've seen many people ask Christians to prove that God exists, prove that Jesus exists, prove that these certain events in the Bible happened. And while I recognize that most of these people probably don't mean prove with 100% certainty, well, I have genuinely seen some people explicitly demand that Christians prove these things with 100% certainty. And so I want to emphasize something very important. We cannot prove any of these things related to Christianity, not because we don't have evidence for these things, but because there's very little in this world we can prove with 100% certainty. For example, you can't prove with certainty if someone is guilty in court, and yet if there's enough evidence to show they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, they are going to be sentenced for that crime. You can't prove that various scientific discoveries and theories are true, but that doesn't mean I'm going to start jumping off of roofs because we can't prove that gravity is true. In addition to that, you also can't prove that various historical events took place. For example, I can't prove that the Battle of Kadesh happened. I can't prove that Julius Caesar was assassinated. I can't prove that the Vikings discovered the Americas centuries before Columbus. I can't even prove that people like Plato, Alexander the Great, and Shakespeare and Napoleon Bonaparte even existed. But to say that these things in history aren't true, or to say that these people don't exist because we can't prove these things with 100% certainty, well, that would just be ludicrous, because if we're raising the standard to prove this with 100% certainty, we'll have to basically throw out all human knowledge. That is not a reasonable standard. And so, as we can see, there is a lot of knowledge we may take for granted that can't technically be proven. But just because we can't prove something, that doesn't mean it isn't actually true. So, what do I mean by this? Well, okay, we can't necessarily prove that Christianity is true, but that isn't because there isn't good evidence for it. It's just because, like I said, math is one of the only fields where we can definitively prove things. Now, when we look at science, history, and court cases, all three of these fields can determine what is true by looking for what the most probable explanation for something is, given the data that we have. Now, the types of evidence that we'll use in science, history, and the court of law will generally differ quite strongly. So let's start by talking about each of these three fields to determine how we can come to true conclusions in these different fields. Because by understanding how we come to conclusions in these fields, we can dispel numerous misunderstandings about the evidence for Christianity. Let's start with science. How do we determine what's true in science? Well, to do that, we need to use the scientific method. To make a very long story short, this is basically how the scientific method works. First things first, you ask a question about some sort of natural phenomena. Then you decide to do some background research to determine if anyone has answered that question already. If you've done enough research and you find that nobody seems to have answered this question you've come up with, well, then you can make a hypothesis based on your research question. Now, for this presentation, I'm going to use some of my own research that I'm currently doing as an example. Now, for our research, our current hypothesis is that various varieties of barley might have different specific species of fungi associated with their roots. So one variety of barley might have species A and B associated with it. A different variety of barley might have fungi species C and D associated with it. Another variety might have species A and E associated with it, and so on and so forth. So basically the main idea behind our hypothesis is that different varieties of barley have different species of fungi that associate with them and basically help them to do their jobs. Now, our hypothesis was based on a research question that we wanted to answer, this being, do specific species of fungi associate with specific varieties of barley? Now, after coming up with our hypothesis, we will then do an experiment to check whether or not our hypothesis is true. In the case of our research, what we did is we planted 4 different varieties of barley in 3 different fields, each of these fields having slightly different environmental conditions. And by doing this, we could basically gauge whether or not these different varieties consistently have specific species of fungi associated with them, even if they're planted in different environmental conditions. So, after developing this sort of experiment, we then perform the experiment and collect all of the data. After collecting the data, we will then analyze the results to see if they line up with our hypothesis. In our case, if we find that specific varieties of barley consistently have specific species of fungi associated with their root systems, regardless of their environment, that would match up basically perfectly with our hypothesis. Now, the problem with science is you don't always get what you want in science. I've learned that the hard way, probably 3 times now. And so sometimes the results of your experiment don't actually match your original hypothesis. If, for example, in our study, we found that multiple different varieties of barley had the exact same fungi species associated with them, that would strongly go against our hypothesis. And when that happens, you need to either tweak your hypothesis Or, depending on how badly the results contradict it, you might need to scrap the hypothesis altogether and make a new one. After you do that, tweaking the hypothesis or scrapping it, you then test that new hypothesis with an experiment. You then collect and analyze the data, see if it lines up with the new hypothesis, and so on and so forth. And if all goes well, then there you go. You've shown that your hypothesis is eventually true. So now you may have a better idea of what the scientific method is, and that's great. When it comes to science, there are two extremely important things to keep in mind. The first thing to keep in mind about science is this. Science is the study of the natural world and how it normally operates. So when we're doing science, we are looking at natural phenomena. And when I say natural, I don't mean like the organic or the all-natural type of natural. When I say natural, I mean anything in the physical, material world. This means things like plastics, genetically modified organisms, and machines would all qualify as things within the natural world because all of these are physical things that you can study using something like biology, chemistry, or physics, respectively. So the first thing that's most important to keep in mind with science is that science studies the natural world, the material world, the physical world. The second thing to keep in mind with regards to science is that science ought to be replicable. For example, the research that I'm currently doing could be very feasibly replicated by another lab. And if that other lab gets the same results, or at the very least very similar results to what we get, that would show that our hypothesis is likely to be true. Basically, if your hypothesis is right, you should be able to do the exact same experiment multiple times and get basically the same results every time. And so this is another very important thing to keep in mind with regards to science. Science should be replicable. So, science studies the natural world and how it normally operates. And because we're studying how the natural world normally operates, that's why science needs to be replicable. And knowing these two things is extremely important because this is sometimes the second issue I see when people ask for evidence for Christianity. This, of course, being some people think only scientific evidence counts as evidence. But there's two extremely massive issues with demanding direct scientific evidence for Christianity. The first issue with this is that science, as I said before, studies the natural world. But God, by definition, is not part of the natural world. God, by nature, is a supernatural being, and he would be beyond the confines of the universe. Remember, Christians at the end of the day claim that God created the universe, in the same way that an author might create a book, or an artist might create a painting. Now, when you are trying to find evidence for an author or an artist, you're not going to expect to find the author or artist within their work. You don't expect to read the book and find the author inside that book. And the same thing goes for God. If God made the universe, we wouldn't expect to find God somehow within the universe or confined to the universe in some way. And this is why asking for scientific evidence for God doesn't really make any sense, because at the end of the day, science studies that which is within the universe, physical things within the universe. It doesn't study what lies beyond it. So to use science alone to try to find God would actually be using the wrong tool for the job. To use an analogy, let's just say for the sake of argument, I'm on a beach and I want to know if there's any plastic on that beach. Would it be reasonable for me to conclude that there's no plastic on the beach because I combed the entire beach with my metal detector and it didn't pick up any plastic? Well, no, that's not a reasonable conclusion because I'm using the wrong tool for the job. And this is the issue with trying to use science to prove or disprove the existence of God. You are using the wrong tool to find God. You are using the wrong type of evidence. But what do I mean by the wrong type of evidence? Well, here's another way of thinking about it. There are multiple things that we cannot know are true using the scientific method. For example, basically every historical event that we're aware of can't be verified using the scientific method. And why is that? Well, because of what I've mentioned before. Science needs to be replicable. But historical events, by definition, cannot be replicated. You can't spin back the clock to redo Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre to see how that played out. You can't go back in time to confirm that Constantine signed off on the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. And you can't go back in time and replicate the French Revolution. Every single one of these things is a historical event that happened one time, and thus it can't ever be replicated. And therefore, you can't use the scientific method to show that these things happen. So, in addition to that, the same thing goes on in court. If someone's on trial for murder, the defense can't demand that the prosecution somehow replicate the entire event to scientifically prove that their client murdered the victim. That's just not possible, because at the end of the day, the murder is a past event. And so different types of evidence are needed to show something is true in history and in court when compared to showing if something is true in science. Because the evidence we use to show something is scientifically true just doesn't apply to history or to court cases. And this is the second reason why asking for scientific evidence for God is the wrong approach. Because when Christians talk about God, we acknowledge that God has a will of his own. He's not necessarily obligated to do something the exact same way every single time just because you want him to. In science, because we are looking at the natural world, and because the natural world abides by very specific natural laws, we can expect to get consistent results when we're doing the exact same experiment over and over again. So I just want to repeat that for clarity. When we are studying things in science, we are studying things in the natural world, and these things in the natural world operate according to specific laws of nature, which is why we can expect consistent results. And I think by now you might be seeing the problem. If God exists, he doesn't exist within the natural world. He is beyond the natural world, and therefore he wouldn't be subject to the laws of nature in the same way that we are, because we too are part of the natural world. So, we shouldn't actually expect to be able to do an experiment in which God consistently does something the same way every single time, because if that did happen, it would imply that God is bound by the laws of nature in some way. And this is why when I was taking a course on evolution of all things in university, they emphasized that science has no direct bearing on the existence of God. Because at the end of the day, the focus of science is on the natural world and how it normally operates. It's not about determining whether or not something beyond the natural world exists, which is why most scientists aren't bold enough to claim that science has disproven God, because most scientists recognize science can't tell you if God doesn't exist, because God is kind of beyond the confines of what we're studying in science. Now, there is one last thing I want to add to avoid confusion, because I've been talking about how God isn't within nature and such. So I just want to emphasize this. I am not saying that God can't act on the universe if he wanted to. He can indeed act on the material world. If, hypothetically, God made the world, which I think most of us are inclined to believe, well, there isn't really anything that would feasibly prevent him from acting on the world after he made it. If we want to go back to the analogy of an artist, let's say for the sake of argument, an artist paints a painting and he finally finishes it up. And after looking at the painting one last time after he finishes it, he realizes there's some more detail he wants to add. There's nothing that would feasibly prevent the artist from adding those details after he finished his painting. And similarly, if God made the universe, if God had the ability to create the physical world, and if he then wanted to act on the physical world in some way after the fact, there's really nothing that would prevent him from doing that. It's perfectly feasible he would be able to act on the material world. And this is how we could explain miracles. If God exists, miracles are not only possible, but they are actually perfectly reasonable. Now, some people might object to that. They might say that, well, miracles can't happen because miracles violate the laws of nature. Now, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. Not every miracle violates the laws of nature. However, there are genuinely some miracles that do violate the laws of nature. A good example of this would be the law of conservation of mass. This is an extremely important law in chemistry, and it basically states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. What this means is that in a chemical reaction, the amount and type of atoms that you start with in a reaction should basically be the exact same by the time the reaction is finished. For example, in this reaction between methane and oxygen, we start off with 1 green carbon atom, 4 blue hydrogen atoms, and 4 pink oxygen atoms. And by the time we're done the reaction, we have, once again, 1 green carbon atom, 4 blue hydrogen atoms, and 4 pink oxygen atoms. Notice here that none of the matter in this reaction was created or destroyed. None of the atoms that we started with were destroyed during the reaction, and no new atoms showed up spontaneously when we did the reaction. And so this is basically the law of conservation of mass in action. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. And so we come to a bit of a problem when we look at the Bible. You see, in the Bible, we read stories where Jesus feeds well over 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And as you might be able to understand, you can't really do that without violating the law of conservation of mass, because you could barely feed 1 person with that amount of food, let alone well over 5,000. And so by necessity, you would have to create mass for such a miracle like this to occur, which seems to violate the law of conservation of mass. Not only that, when we look at Jesus walking on water, that defies everything we know about buoyancy and the surface tension of water. And when Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, that violates everything we know about human biology and medical science. And that's the point, and that's not a problem. You see, at the end of the day, there are many different definitions of miracles that have been thrown around over the centuries, but I think probably the best way I've seen a miracle defined is that a miracle is when an agent outside of the natural world does something within the universe, within the natural world, that wouldn't normally take place if the natural world was operating like it normally does. So I just want to repeat this definition for clarity, because this is sometimes the biggest mistake people make when it comes to evaluating miracle claims. A miracle is when an agent outside of the natural world, outside of the universe, does something within the natural world that wouldn't normally take place if the natural world was operating as it normally does. And remember what I said earlier. God is beyond the universe. The natural world is his creation, and that means he isn't subject to the natural laws that the creation abides by. So this means that because he is the creator of the laws of nature, and because the laws of nature basically just describe how things in the natural world operate when no outside force is acting on them, God defying the laws of nature isn't actually a problem, because God would definitely qualify as an outside force or something outside of the natural world that could feasibly defy those laws. Let me give a kind of weird analogy that I came up with to maybe help you better understand this. Let's say, for the sake of argument, there's an author who makes a fantasy book series. In the setting of that fantasy book, there's a complex magic system that abides by several rules. Say, to do any sort of magic, you need to use a staff, you need to consume specific herbs, and use a series of complex phrases to do any sort of magic. So in order to do healing magic, invisibility, fireballs, whatever you want, you need all three of these components: a staff, a series of phrases, and, of course, the consumption of herbs. Now let's say after the author has created this complex magic system in this book, he then inserts a prophet character into the story, one who can heal people and tell the future without doing any of these things. He is defying the laws of magic that were just established in this book. And he's doing that because the prophet is praying to the quote-unquote author of the universe. Now, the prophet character definitely seems to be violating the laws of magic in that universe, and yet the prophet character still makes sense in the story. Because even though he's violating the laws of magic that are established in the book, the author of the universe isn't subject to those laws, because he's the one writing the book. He's the one who made those laws, and they don't apply to him, because he's outside of the book where those laws are operating. To give a geographic analogy, I am not subject to the laws of the United States, because I'm not in the United States right now. And if God is outside of the universe, and this isn't exactly the same jurisdiction he's in, then he wouldn't have to abide by those laws. And so this is why I'm saying it's not only possible, but actually reasonable that miracles can occur if God exists. Because if God exists, he isn't a part of the natural world, and thus he isn't subject to its laws. Now, if miracles are possible, how can we know whether or not God has performed any miracles? Now, there's multiple different fields of study that look at evidence in different ways to evaluate what's true using different methods compared to science. And I think the two fields that might help us best understand how we can evaluate miracle claims and how we can evaluate the evidence for Christianity would be the fields of history and the court of law. Because the way in which they analyze evidence is actually pretty consistent with what we're going to try to do in the upcoming presentations when it comes to analyzing the evidence for the existence of God. So how do we come to true conclusions in history and in court? Well, let's start with court. In court cases, there are two different types of evidence that someone will use to determine if someone is guilty or innocent. The two different types of evidence are direct evidence and indirect evidence, sometimes known as circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is basically just eyewitness testimony, whereas indirect evidence basically includes anything that isn't eyewitness testimony. So this would include fingerprints and footprints, DNA evidence at the scene of the crime, statements made by witnesses and the suspect, expert testimony, along with whether or not the suspect has an alibi, and any behaviors made by the suspect that could act as red flags as to whether or not they're guilty. So all of this evidence would be used to determine if someone is guilty or innocent in court. Now, if you're trying to convict someone as being guilty in a criminal court case, you need to show that someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And what that means is that you need to be able to provide enough evidence to convince the jury that there's no other reasonable explanation for the evidence. So there might be other explanations for the evidence, but they aren't reasonable ones. Now, that's the kind of evidence you need for a criminal court case. But when it comes to civil court cases, we actually use a different standard to evaluate the evidence, known as the preponderance of the evidence. The main idea behind using the preponderance of the evidence to show something is true is that basically to prove that a proposition is true using the preponderance of evidence, you need to show that a proposition is more likely to be true than untrue. So basically, you need to show that there's a 50% or greater chance that your claim is true compared to it being false. And here we actually see some very clear standards to use when it comes to evaluating evidence. When we're evaluating evidence, we should look for the most likely explanation of what happened, the most probable explanation of what happened. We're not looking at explanations that are simply possible or plausible. We are looking at the ones that are most likely. And that's why even when we're being lenient and using the preponderance of the evidence standard, we're still looking for something that has a 50% or greater chance of being true, because we want the best explanation for the evidence, not simply a explanation. You want the most probable explanation. Now, we see something very similar when we look at history. When it comes to history, we unfortunately don't usually have the luxury of being able to talk to eyewitnesses like we can in court. I can't exactly interview someone who knew Julius Caesar personally to see what his life was like. However, historians will use evidence very similar to what's used in court to determine historical facts. Historians will look at things like primary sources, secondary sources, and artifacts to basically determine what's true historically and reconstruct historical events. Historians will try to basically gauge the reliability of these sources using what's known as source criticism. In source criticism, historians try to figure out who wrote a source, when the source was written, and where the source was written. Knowing these details can tell us how reliable a source is. For example, let's say you wanted to know accurate information about Julius Caesar, who was assassinated in Rome in 44 BC. Who would you rather use as a source for Julius Caesar's life? A source written in 14 BC by a Roman senator who knew Caesar, like the guy shown in here? Or would you rather use as a source a medieval Scottish clergyman writing about Julius Caesar in 900 AD? You'd probably want to use the former source, and the reason for that is because the closer a source is to the historical events in question, the more reliable that source is generally considered to be. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, but on a general basis, primary sources, or sources that are closer to the historical events, tend to be more reliable than sources that are made much later and much further away from the event. And this relates to the difference between primary and secondary sources, like I kind of blurted out there. Primary sources are generally the best for determining historical truths because primary sources are written close to the event in question, ideally being written by eyewitnesses. Now, the guy we mentioned earlier, the senator who knew Julius Caesar personally, he would qualify as a primary source in our example. And the medieval Scottish clergyman would qualify as a secondary source. Secondary sources tend to be written long after the event in question, and they are always not based on eyewitnesses. No eyewitnesses write something about a historical event if we're looking at a secondary source. However, I should note, and this is where some of the exceptions can sometimes come into play, secondary sources can be based off of earlier sources. So for example, the medieval Scottish clergyman, he's probably not just making things up out of thin air. He might be looking at a source written around like maybe 100 AD on Julius Caesar's life and writing a biography based on those historical sources. However, at the same time, secondary sources are generally, because they're more far removed from the events, considered less reliable than primary sources. So now you can see here, this is kind of how a historian operates. They're going to look at when a source was written, who wrote the source, etc., to basically gauge how reliable it is. And this is extremely important because when a historian is looking at these historical sources, they're also going to try to gauge whether or not a source is a forgery. To use an example that's extremely relevant to Christian apologetics, the image on the right here is an image of one of the oldest complete copies of the Gospel of Mark and Luke. Now, here's the thing that's very interesting that a lot of people don't actually know about. Scholars across religious lines, atheists and Christians alike, agree that both Mark and Luke were written in the 1st century, at most a few decades after Jesus' ministry. Not only that, Mark implicitly notes multiple times in his gospel that he used eyewitnesses to make his gospel, and Luke explicitly states that he used eyewitnesses to make his gospel. So, given that these sources were written close to the historical events and based on eyewitness testimony, not only would Mark and Luke be considered legitimate sources of information to know about Jesus' life, they would also be considered primary sources. To contrast the Gospel of Mark and Luke, the black book shown here is a copy of the Gospel of Barnabas. Now, for those of you who are very familiar with your Bible, you might know that the Gospel of Barnabas isn't in your Bible. And the reason for that is because it wasn't written by Barnabas. You see, Barnabas lived in the 1st century AD, and he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. Now, the Gospel of Barnabas was written at the very earliest in the mid-1300s, so about 1,300 years after Barnabas died. So obviously, this Gospel of Barnabas was not actually written by Barnabas. It was a forgery penned in his name. And because it is a forgery, it basically means it can't actually tell us any reliable information about the past. There's a few different theories on who made the gospel. I think the leading one is that it was a convert from Christianity to Islam who was writing this gospel to basically try to prove Islam. But either way, because it's an obvious forgery, it can tell us no reliable information about Jesus' life. And so when historians are looking at these historical sources to determine what's true, they are very careful to check whether or not the sources they're using are forgeries, because if they are forgeries, they can't tell you reliable information about the past. Now, eventually, after historians get all their sources together and scrutinize them, they will then collect all the data that they get from those sources and use that data to piece together what happened in history based on those sources. However, I should also note historians do try to keep in mind that sometimes sources might be slightly inaccurate. A great and, in my mind, very amusing example of this is the Battle of Kadesh that I mentioned earlier. The Battle of Kadesh was a battle that took place in the Bronze Age between the Hittite Empire and Egypt under the rule of Ramesses II. Now, what's interesting about this battle is that not only was it one of the largest Bronze Age battles, and not only was it one of the largest chariot battles in history, but what's most intriguing about this battle is that we actually have both Hittite and Egyptian accounts of what happened during the battle. So, considering we have reports from both sides about how this battle played out, who do you guys think won the battle? Anyone have any guesses? Yeah, no, history is written by the victors, except in this case, because, both sides claim they won the battle. And as you could probably tell, that can't be possible. You can't have two sides both winning the battle. So usually historians will basically scrutinize both of these sources very carefully, and I think the general conclusion that's been come to is that the Battle of Kadesh was ultimately a stalemate, one in which both sides suffered heavy losses, which basically allowed both sides to play up their small victories as though they won the whole battle. And so, once again, historians do try to keep in mind that sometimes the historical sources they're using might be slightly inaccurate if there's some sort of bias going on there. So now, you should hopefully understand the kind of evidence that we'll use in court and in history, and that should help us going forward when we discuss the evidence for the existence of God, because the methods that we're generally using in court and in history to determine what's true are actually fairly similar to what we're going to use going forward when it comes to evaluating the evidence for Christianity. However, I should note something important that kind of applies to every field of study. When we are looking at anything, we are always going to be trying to find out what the most likely explanation for the data is. We're looking for the most probable explanation for the data. Just because an explanation is possible or even plausible, that doesn't necessarily make it true. At the end of the day, we're going to try to find the most likely explanation for the data. So this is, I think, probably the best criteria to keep in mind moving forward. Now, before I summarize everything that we just went over, I want to briefly touch on two very common misconceptions that people have about the evidence for Christianity. And the first has to do with the Bible. Many people believe that the Bible is completely fictional. Basically, the Bible has no more historical value than Harry Potter does. It's completely fictional. But there is a massive issue with this view. This, of course, being that even atheist historians don't hold to it. Historians, including atheist ones, will often use the Bible to understand what happened in the past. And I'm going to go into much more detail on this topic when I talk about the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus. However, for now, just note, historians do sometimes use the Bible as a historical source on ancient Israel and ancient Palestine. And the reason for this is because the Bible presents itself as a historical document of what happened in the ancient Near East from between about 1300 BC to 100 AD. In addition to this, we also have multiple outside sources, such as written material and archaeological evidence, that have validated many of the historical details found within the Bible. And so even non-Christian historians will generally acknowledge and use the Bible to understand historical events, because at the end of the day, even if a historian doesn't believe every single detail of the Bible, which most atheist historians don't, obviously, they still recognize that it's a largely viable source of historical information. And so the first misconception I want to clear up is this. Nobody who has diligently studied the Bible in academia actually thinks the Bible is completely fictional. If someone says that the Bible is completely fictional, they are the ones who have to show that, and they need very significant evidence to do so, because the evidence we have that it isn't fictional is quite strong. The last misconception I want to very briefly clarify is the concept of faith, and we did not collaborate on this, which is why you might be getting some déjà vu during this section. You see, many people might ask, why am I giving a presentation like this in the first place? After all, faith at the end of the day is simply belief in something without evidence. And because faith is a virtue, I'm probably making all of you less virtuous because I'm giving evidence for these beliefs. And that's a problem, isn't it? Well, that's the thing. If you believe that faith is belief in something without evidence, then I do want to say, and I'm sorry to say this, but you have faith in that definition of faith. You see, faith in the English language is more synonymous with basically trust or confidence in something. For example, I have faith in my bank account that they're not just going to steal all the money that is in my bank account. I also have faith in my doctor that he's not just going to misdiagnose me with some disease for the fun of it and then prescribe me something because he just felt like it that day. I have enough faith in my doctor that he wouldn't do that. In addition to that, I have enough faith that I'm actually experiencing the real world right now and that everything around me isn't just some sort of hallucination. And I have faith in all these things because of the evidence that's been given to me by these things that I can trust in them. And so faith is not belief in something without evidence. Faith at the end of the day is trust in something. In fact, when we look at faith, the original Greek term that the Bible uses that's translated as faith is the term pistis or piston. I couldn't get the original actual Greek letters to work, so that's the transliteration of the Greek. Now, pistis or piston is the term we translate as faith in the Bible, and this was basically defined as trust in something, assurance of something, or loyalty to something. So the term faith that we use in the Bible was never understood to mean belief in something without evidence. And in fact, the Bible repeatedly gives us examples of how people would use evidence to bolster people's faith, as Stephen so graciously showed us. So in short, faith is not belief in something without evidence. Faith in a Christian sense is trust in God because of the evidence he has given to us. Now, I recognize we have gone over a lot of information so far. So let's just briefly summarize what we've learned today. The first thing we learned is that evidence is any piece of information or any fact that makes a claim more likely to be true. And so this means that things like physical evidence, eyewitness reports, and logical arguments could all qualify as evidence for something because they raise the probability of that something being true. After that, we discussed the scientific method a bit. Well, before that, we mentioned that we can't exactly prove anything unless we're talking about math here. But after that, we discussed the scientific method and how science looks at the natural world and how it normally operates using replicable experiments, which is why you can't directly prove or disprove the existence of God using science, because God is beyond the natural world, and thus using a tool that studies the natural world alone to find evidence for God probably isn't the best idea. After that, we talked about how, regardless of the field of study we're looking at, you are going to try to find the most likely explanation for the evidence you have. You aren't going to simply look at possible or plausible explanations, you are going to look at the most likely explanation for the evidence. Finally, we talked about how the Bible is not completely fictional, and nobody who is studying this in the academy even believes this. And in addition to that, we finally discussed how faith is not belief in something without evidence, but rather it is trust in God because of the evidence he's provided. Now, with all that being said, thank you for listening, and I do want to say, I apologize if this talk felt like trying to drink from a fire hose of information. If you've ever heard any of my talks, you know that I try to be as thorough as possible when it comes to what I'm discussing. And the reason for that is because I knew that this talk is going to be recorded. I'm going to be re-uploading it to my own YouTube channel at a later period. That channel, of course, being Vapememes 2020. I had an interesting experience at university today. I was briefly eating lunch in between trying to do some tests for my thesis, and someone walked up to me and basically just asked me, "Hey, are you Vapememes?" And I have never been both less and more proud of hearing that. So just know, if you feel like you missed anything in this talk is being recorded, and so that way you could re-watch this talk if you felt like you missed anything, or alternatively, because we're moving into our question period, feel free to ask either myself or Stephen any questions that are related to the talks, and we'll be more than happy to answer. Additionally, if you want more information on this specific topic, I would highly recommend J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, as he kind of goes into detail with some of the discussions on how we can use evidence to come to conclusions.